Got folks coming in on all our various channels. YouTube is streaming and LinkedIn, and folks coming in on Zoom as well. So I think we are ready to go and get started.
Okay, welcome everyone. Today we're talking about leader versus manager, which turns out to be a hot topic still. It's one of those topics that's been around for a really long time, but people are still interested. We think that could be because there are a lot of new managers and a lot of people who are moving up. So maybe there's more curiosity about that. We don't know, but that's just a theory. So this is part of our series, what we call our team leadership series. And you can see where we're focused today is leader versus manager. And next week we will be focused on leading change you don't like, which is also a hot topic. It's a topic that it comes up a lot. So anyway, we're going to do that, not next week, but the week after that. So that's our series. So before we get into the content, just want to share our change and joy model briefly before we get into all the details of our topic today. This is the model we share every time. We believe you can have change and joy at the same time. Oftentimes people think that's not possible. It can be surprising for folks. As a matter of fact, when we interviewed an executive about what joy at work meant to him, he called change a joy killer. So I can understand why most people think that way, but we think a little differently. And the way we think about our model is that when you introduce change, you have an impact on joy at work, which we see as those dimensions on the right. And vice versa, how much joy at work already exists in your company can affect how well the change goes. So that's how we see the two related, just very briefly. So our focusing question today is, when do I lead and when do I manage? So before we go into that, I wanted to just quickly share oftentimes we share the popular literature that we are reading on joy. And the one we wanted to talk about just really briefly and just highlight is this book called Joy on Demand by Cheng-Ming Tang. And if you are interested in meditation, lots of folks are interested in meditation nowadays, especially with burnout. This has a joy slant to it. So if you are into meditation, you're interested in joy, this is a really great book. And he has a bunch of things also available on YouTube. And of course, then there's Cookie Monster, our big inspiration for joy. He's very focused, though. Joy of cookies is his thing. He's very focused. Anyway, this is a really fun book and always inspiring to us.
Still one of the great philosophers of the 20th and now 21st century.
Right.
So, I think Cookie Monster has something to say to all of us about joy.
How can you not experience joy looking at this image? Okay, so some people ask us, what does joy at work mean to us? What does that mean? This is our definition. We see it as employee willingness to do these things, to commit, be accountable, to participate, etc. But it's really a two-way street. The company, the leaders and managers have to create the conditions for employees to be able to contribute this way and extend this invitation. And then, of course, employees have to accept that invitation. The idea here is that a company can actually cultivate an environment where these things can exist, but if the employee doesn't accept the invitation, it doesn't work. And then vice versa. You can be willing to be accountable and willing to grow and demonstrate respect, but if the company doesn't value that, then it's hard to get traction on that. So this is our definition of joy at work. And how that relates to what we're talking about? Well, we're focusing in on accountability, which turns out to be one of the things that lots of folks are thinking about nowadays. What we've noticed is that with folks being in the hybrid workplace or remote workplace, there is less investment in each other's success, especially with the recent reorganization, the reshuffle of people. Maybe you don't know folks very well, and maybe it's, spend very much time with them. So it's hard to really build that relationship. So accountability is one of those things that people are asking us about, how do we get more of that in this new way of working? So we'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to the topic today.
And so these are the areas I want to try and focus on. We're going to start straight on with this whole leader versus manager thing. Like, what is that? And we really do see this as a distinction with an important difference. So it actually is meaningful. It's not just a semantic squabble in here. And we'll talk to you about that. And then move on to the leader's intention and how that comes out in these 4 different kinds of conversations, 4 authentic conversations that leaders can have with their team. And we'll walk you through what those are. But we want to end with some specifics, some really tactical specifics on what you can do to take that intention forward and have that in both a mindset as a leader or as a manager, because we see those as distinct and being used distinctly. So let's jump in just straight into that piece as well, leader versus manager. And for us, this is a when conversation. So when are you one and when are you the other? Not necessarily just you get one view or the other. And it's interesting to look at what others have said about it. So Peter Drucker has this one, which is relatively famous: management is doing things right, leadership is doing the right things. And I think there's some value to that. You'll see as we think about it that this idea fits inside of that. And then President Eisenhower, leadership is the art of getting someone else to do something you want done because he wants to do it. Maybe a little manipulative, but it gets into the idea of inspiration, at least. So the notion of inspiring is important here when we start to think about leadership. And then Grace Hopper was admiral in the Navy, the first female admiral in the Navy. You manage things, you lead people. And then she goes further on to say, we went overboard on management and forgot about leadership, which is she was a very insightful leader, and interesting to read the kinds of things that she was writing about leadership generally, and then specifically about women, especially in the 70s and 80s, coming in as significant leaders, both in the military as well as in the civilian world. But when we think about it, we're really coming back to try and answer this question. Are leader and manager, those words, is that a role? Is it a title, a calling? Is it totally something else? And so we want to talk to you about how we see these things, because we do see them as distinct. And it's important, I think, to see those distinctions.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, a lot of times people think of this as status, right? So manager is considered lower status. You see that a lot. Leader is considered higher status. How do you see that? I would love to hear how you see that, because I think that can be, people want to stay away from management. Oftentimes they kind of shun that word, and They want to be leader. But it would be interesting to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I really don't think it has anything to do with status. The way in which I think about leader is that it's something that's given to you, that you have to have followers to be a leader. And so the followers actually choose. They're the ones that choose whether or not you're going to be their leader. You may have a title or role that says manager, right? So you can be given a job. There's a job called manager, and there's lots of those with lots of other things, lots of other words wrapped around manager.
Right.
And that is great. And I think that makes sense within the confines of the organization and how do you hire people and all. But I don't see anyone as a leader unless the people that are the followers actually designate them as a leader. And we're going to talk about the actions and when you do one versus the other. But I don't think that leader gets appointed. It isn't actually a title. Manager is an okay title. Leader is a role that's given to you by the people that you are leading, your followers. And I think if you can think about it that way, it's interesting. The way I got to that was thinking about a comment about someone is not a professor unless you have students. So you can have the title, right? But you're not really a professor. You don't profess unless somebody comes to listen to you. And they get to they're choosing, right? Students in college choose what classes they want to take. They may have required things to go do, but they'll steer away from people called professor that they don't learn anything from.
Hmm.
And I think it's similar here. Your leader is something that is bestowed upon you. So let's talk a little bit about what's in that. So we do actually see leaders and managers doing different things, and so the when do you do them becomes important. So when we think about leaders, start with these really big things. So this idea of the vision, describing a vision, and then declaring a mission for what the team or the organization is going to go do. And those can sound like big, giant, lofty words, and we don't mean them that way. We mean them more actionable. So vision is where are you going? The word leader actually comes from a core word that is to go. So leaders take people somewhere. That's why I think it's important for leaders to only get designated if you have followers, because you're basically saying, come follow me. And if nobody follows, well, you're not a leader. And if they do, then you are. So that you need to tell people where you want to go and why you want to get there. And then the mission gets to the what. What do you want them to actually kind of gets more to the specifics about what the organization is about.
Well, before you go further, what you're reminding me of is influencers, right? So oftentimes influencers in the organizational context, they don't necessarily have a title that would be considered leadership, but people are definitely following them.
Right, exactly. I think that completely connects. That makes sense to me. The leader is also about now getting people aligned to the future. So sometimes the word strategy is used, and again, that's a big, giant, loaded word. But I think of that really broadly as understanding where you think the world is going to go, and then position your organization to go in the direction that makes sense, given that that's where they're going. That's it. It doesn't have to be any more lofty or complex than that, and just understanding the direction that's there. And so leaders are engage in the act of coaching. And we're going to talk more about what that means. So leaders guide people through coaching, and that's very different than what managers are going to do. We'll talk quite a bit more in depth about that.
We had a comment from Robert Snyder. I remember a funny, snarky phrase. If you think you're a leader, look over your shoulder. If no one is there, you're just out for a walk.
Awesome. It is great, Robert. That's a great comment. Yeah, same thing, right? No one is following you. You're not really a leader. I love the idea that you're out for a walk. So this last notion here about coaching is going to be important, and an important distinction as well. So as we move to manager, now manager, I start to think about the particular. So first, describing what the milestones are. So how do you know that you're going to be executing on the things that take you on to the mission that you put together, and then declaring the work. We're actually making choices about what's going to get done and what doesn't get done. So managers are in there as the choosers and prioritizers of the work, and make the decisions about what's going to happen and what isn't going to happen, and pull that together with the milestones so that you understand the when of all of that. And that means that managers are about people, developing the people. So how do you get there as a good manager? Well, you help the people get better at what they do, improve their skills, help them employ their competencies. And managers mentor. And I'm differentiating that from coaching, and we'll again dive into that more. But this is more of a directing kind of a conversation, as opposed to a guiding thinking kind of a conversation. And I think that's going to be important, and hopefully you'll see that when we pull these together. But we think of these roles as different, and the when around that is going to be related to the activities that are needed in order for the group to be successful. And so I'm sure all of you have experienced people that are probably good managers, but maybe not great leaders, right? So they've developed those skills. They're great at making things more efficient. They can optimize all those things, but they don't really set a direction. And that doesn't make them bad people, but they're not going to be successful moving into the next level where you're really trying to move the entire organization. You might also have experienced the opposite as well. People that are good leaders, but are terrible managers. So they have the right ideas, but they cannot execute.
Mm.
And so they could talk about this awesome, better future, maybe even in very compelling ways, and then not be able to execute on any of that stuff because they can't do the management work. I think those are more rare, but had some of those as well.
Yeah, so we got a comment from Stuart about, I don't think he likes your definition of coaching.
No.
So I think, so when you go there, I think it would be cool to talk more about how we apply coaching,
Okay.
right?
Yeah, so let me dive on that more as we get down into it. And we'll see if you still hate my definition then, or
Yeah,
hate how
thank
we're
you,
thinking
Stuart,
about
for
it,
that comment.
or
That's good.
maybe the difference has some usefulness, some meaning for you in there. So let's get into these 4 different conversations and how we really think about them. And it's really about this relationship that a manager or leader is going to have with the team, and it comes through talking to them, comes through conversations. So that's where the relationship is actually in that. And so here are the 4 that we lay out. So I'm going to start in the bottom right. So managing conversation. So that's about what to do. So it's more of a directive conversation. It gets into the specifics, and the point of it would be to remove the ambiguity. Whereas a move to the left to a leading conversation, that's one that's about communicating the vision. Like, where are we going to? Right. So management actually that word actually comes from manipulate. So it is about doing the specific things, whereas leading is about where are you going to go? And then the differentiation on coaching and mentoring. So coaching I see is something that helps an employee with their thinking about how to do the work. And so when I think about coaching, I think of it more and from the point of view of a coach who is a musician coaching another musician, or a sports coach that's trying to guide people to be able to think through whatever the problem is, playing a certain piece of music or executing a certain play in sports, and how would the coach have them think about it. I recognize that that is different than how the International Coaching Federation or other organizations like that would define coaching. So if you're thinking about it like that, I admit and agree that the definition I just offered is very different than that. But I offer this to you because I think it's valuable for leaders to be able to think of themselves as coaching this in this way. For me, it first showed up in my very first career as a pilot. So when I was a pilot in the Navy, at one point, I was an instructor, and I could tell the students what to do, and they'll never, ever learn if I just continue to tell them each individual piece on what they're supposed to be executing on. But if I would coach them from the point of view of getting them to analyze the problem, analyze where we were on the flight path the way I would, then now they get a chance to learn from me what are the ways in which I gain insights to go do something, and they get to incorporate that in how they fly. And so that's the idea that we have here around coaching in the business context, to be able to help someone to understand how the leader thinks about solving that problem, so that they get to incorporate that and improve their skills as a result of that. Whereas mentoring is much more of a directive conversation. So when I think of mentoring, I think that I am telling somebody what I suggest they do based on my experience. I'm not necessarily trying to get them to understand my thinking. I'm trying to get them to be able to connect to the experience I have, whether it's a mistake that I made in the past, which is often where it comes from, or one of the smart things that I did, one of the few smart things I did in the past, and be able to convey that to somebody else. Now, again, I see those words get used interchangeably and differently between them. I'm trying to make a specific distinction between them because I think there are different activities there. So I think of that directing conversation more on the right-hand side. Managing and mentoring are more directive, whereas coaching and leading are more pushing out into the where are you going to go in the future, and trying to help you wrap around how to get there. So hopefully at least the thinking through those are a useful way to get there. And if you don't like those definitions, maybe don't key so much on the word as the actions that I think would be valuable, because I do think that those are valuable as part of what a leader is going to go do.
Yeah, and I think my takeaway on the coaching thing is that you are trying to, cultivate their thinking rather than direct it.
Yes. Yeah. I think that
right.
Cultivating, I think, is a good way to say it, express it, think about it. All right, so let's get a little further in there. Now we're talking about this idea of an intention. So what do I really want it to be like? So if whether I'm a leader or a manager, how do I want it to be for my team? And then how do I know it's happening? So what are the signs that tell me that I'm getting to the thing that I want? So I want to go back to those four different conversations. So when I think about managing, when I think about when do I want to do this, and gets into the differentiation between leader and manager, I'm thinking about speed is important, or maybe accuracy is the thing that I want to be about. So I'm telling people what to do. I'm having a directive conversation. We need to go do this work and get it done by this time in order to make it happen. The extreme to that, again, going back to my career as a pilot early on, was add power now because we're going to crash. That is a directive conversation. I'm not coaching them into trying to think about the way I think about it. We have something that we need to take care of immediately. That's a directive conversation. We're back 2 minutes beforehand. Now I might have been coaching them on their flying, but at some point it gets to a place where I have to take action because there's risk and I need to mitigate this risk. That's a physical gut churning risk, but you get those kinds of things in business as well. In any organization, risks on any of those different aspects, and managers getting engaged to mitigate those risks and monitor them is important. So I think of these as how to do it conversation, how to kind of conversations. If I move from that over, just as we did before, into a leading conversation, now we're trying to help the employees see the bigger picture. So this is, why do we want to go over here? Well, let me show you the bigger picture about that. And we want to be able to engage the employees' decision-making, their judgment, so that they can take action that's going to be guided by that vision, right? So I'm not directing them now. I'm trying to tell them, here's where here's what the future looks like, where we want to go, and why do we want to do it, right? This is a why conversation, because now I want my teammates to understand that so that they can make decisions that are based on that why. If I move up to coaching, now I'm trying to help them to be able to do that activity, that decision-making activity, better. So there's an opportunity here to use questions to guide the thinking. So that, I think, statement is in line, or at least more in line with how ICF would think about it, where you use a questioning approach to try and take people forward. But I'm trying to help them improve their judgment, their ability to solve problems without me, right? So I'm helping them to improve their skills. And if they have competencies around this, helping them bring that out. So I think of those as a what conversation. And then finally over to mentoring. I'm really getting specifically now into a person's development based on my knowledge and experience. So I'm essentially saying, were I you, this is what I would do. And I may take that back to when I was in a situation just like yours. This is what happened to me, and it turned out badly. This is why I'm giving you this advice, or it turned out well, and this is why I'm giving you that advice. So it's about the next challenge and the next challenge. This is really development, right? It's about the person. And we're trying to help them to become better at whatever it is that they're trying to drive forward on, and trying to make that more of a reality for them based on the things that I've done. So this comes back then to accountability, which Roxanne highlighted before. And here's our definition. Accountability is the willingness to be held to promises made both explicitly and implicitly. And so in these conversations, the manager and leader, they have an accountability, right? This is not, hey, employees go be accountable. This is about the leader and the manager being accountable, because in that role as a manager, or if you've been given that title by your followers to be a leader, there are explicit and implicit promises that are in there about what you're going to do. We think that executing on those conversations is part of how you go about fulfilling on those promises. And it'll be different at different times, depending on what is required of the team and what needs to happen within the organization.
Yeah, and this is related to joy at work. At least this is what we found. Because if you don't have accountability, people don't understand how to get traction, and they don't, they often self-protect. which is interesting because accountability is often about declaring. So that's interesting. But yeah, so if the accountability is in the environment, you can actually get a lot more traction, and it calms the environment. I understand better about what's expected of me and how we will work together to get it done. So that's why it turns out to be part of a joy at work definition.
So we have a little more depth on this. So we put together a do-it-yourself guide. The guide is very inexpensive. It's $2 and we donate that money. So if you go to the QR code, or you can see the URL there, you could choose one of those 3 organizations. So we've been donating this money to the Ukrainian Red Cross. JDRF is the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, which is important to me. And Ricky's Refuge is as an animal sanctuary, and an enormous, unbelievably well-run animal sanctuary that is here in Virginia that Roxanne has been connected to for a while. You can use the QR code as well. What's in this guide is much more depth into what we just talked about, and a way for you to actually execute it. And we take you through some questions to be able to help you to do that in each of those 4 different areas, really preparatory stuff, so that you can have it in your head when you go to have those 4 different, very important conversations. So with this final piece, then we want to get over into some real specifics for you about how you can go about doing this and provide some structure with it. And we're wrapping this around creating joy in this evolving hybrid workplace, because it has clearly become more difficult for organizations to achieve joy at work while they're trying to work through this very different way of working. Now, not everyone is there, but many organizations are. And most, I would say, have picked up at least some level of hybrid working. Some maybe quite a bit, and some maybe just a little bit. But everyone's trying to work their way through some of that, and to some extent. And so we want to talk a little bit about how to think about some of those. So when we start to get now at the very tactical level, so now we're talking about managers, we think of these 3 things. Managers are about the work, right? So the focus is for the team. How do they bring the team together? How do they bring the insights of the team together so they get a shared experience of what the work is, so they can make smarter decisions about what to do? And then development. Here, the focus is for the manager and the employee to be talking, so that they get aligned and can make decisions about the employee and what the skills the employee needs to develop and employ in order to get better and better. And then finally, an evaluation, which is really about providing a point of view, the manager's point of view, on how the employee is doing to achieve clarity. That evaluation one would be the smallest in terms of time. So work and development, far more important than a constant set of evaluations, but having that evaluation also pretty key. So when we start to think about that, if we want to get really specific, when we are working with companies, we suggest that they think about a weekly team meeting and a discussion that they're able to have with their team every week on the work. Whereas when you're talking with the employees one-on-one, maybe more bi-weekly. And it's not to say you can't do this more frequently, or maybe it's appropriate to do it less frequently. It'll be different in different organizations, but this is a good place to start. And then for the evaluation, a quarterly meeting to come together with your employee, with your teammate, and let them know how they're doing. And for those of you that are super word nerds, you may notice that we have the word discussion, conversation, and dialogue in there. And those are often used interchangeably, but we're making a distinction here. So a discussion is about actually breaking down and solving a problem. That's what the word means. It means its root is to shake up. So we think about a team meeting as an opportunity to problem solve. So not just pass info, but to actually figure things out to solve that problem. Whereas a biweekly one-on-one meeting, a conversation, that literally means to turn together. So the idea is that the employee and the manager are getting on the same page, if you want to use that metaphor. They are coming to a shared understanding about what is important for the employee to do in their development. And then finally, a dialogue in the evaluation, which again, literally means words going in 2 directions. So both the employee and the manager need to say what they need to say, and each need to hear each other. That doesn't mean they have to agree, That's what we need to do in development. But they at least need to hear each other's point of view in order to have that sort of evaluative conversation be useful.
Now, just to make sure I understand, you're not suggesting a performance review every quarter.
Not a review. I'm
Okay.
suggesting a meeting
Okay.
to say, hey, here's how you're doing.
Okay.
This is how things are going. I mean, some organizations do that. I would think of that as a little heavy-handed. Probably don't want to do that every quarter. But I think you want to have at least have this dialogue every quarter so that the person on your team knows where they stand. Are things going well? Or are they not going well?
Gotcha.
This does not have to be some big formalized 360 feedback thing. I've seen people do very successful ones in 10, 12 minutes. That's all you need just to make sure that they really understand what's happening. And so just to fill this out a little bit, if we think about the things that are the overlaps in here, you might pay attention to what are the client outcomes, whether that's an internal client or an external client. That's definitely going to be about the work and definitely be about the development for the employee. So we're looking for those quantifiable outcomes for whoever the end customer is. When we think about it between the evaluation and the development, well, that's the plan, the development plan. And then in between the work and the evaluation could be the skills, the job skills that are there. And you notice we use the word states underneath all of those. All of those can be altered. So you can improve on skills. You can clearly improve on client outcomes. You can improve on your development. Those are things that are movable. But at the core of all this, the center of it are values. Think about it as the personal values that any human has. And we think of those as traits. Like those maybe develop over time, but they're intrinsic to who you are. You don't train in a value. You have it. That's who you are as part of being a human, what those values actually are. So that's kind of the model that we use for that. And a little bit of specifics about the activities to go do to make these things happen. And then this last piece to throw in there for you is thinking in terms of the communication. And we like to think of the media and the message. So what's the thing that you need to talk about? What's the right place to go do it? So when do you want to have a meeting? When do you send it via email? When do you do a text? And that could be a very complicated conversation and probably a worthy one to have. But a great place to start would be with this. What communication channels do you like? And what communication channels do you not like? And why? And what kinds of messages are you comfortable with when you are relaxed? And what's going to happen when you're stressed? How do you handle important information when you're stressed? And you may actually want to use a different media for those messages depending on where you are. And so our suggestion would be think through that a bit and then describe it either to your manager, or if you are a manager, describing that to your team so that you can best work with all of those.
So one of the things that you're reminding me of is this article that I read recently titled "Why You Should Type Less and Talk More According to Science." We're actually going to post that this afternoon on our company LinkedIn website. The thing that was really cool about it and made me think about is we used to use voicemail a lot to communicate, and there's something really cool about having a better understanding of the message through the voice, right? Typing is good, but you can't necessarily get the nuance of the meaning behind the message as well as when you have the voice. And that's what this article was talking about, is how when you have the voice, even if you don't see people, it's actually very bonding, according to this article. But people don't feel comfortable using that channel. They don't feel comfortable necessarily picking up the phone. It feels intrusive, it feels invasive. Right. So the idea is, considering that as one of the real channels that you have as an option in, what you're saying here in terms of preference, making that, kind of normalizing that in the environment. I mean, that's not true for every organization, but that is what that a lot of the clients we work with, especially younger folks, they just don't feel comfortable with just picking up the phone versus text, right? So anyway, just really interesting article, and you'll see that come out later today.
So just to wrap up then, here are the things that we're trying to tune into here. So thinking about the intention as a leader or manager, like where you're trying to go, and underpinning with that has got to be this idea of psychological safety. We didn't talk about that in this webinar, although we have in several of the others that we have done. And having that setup of safety is going to be important. And part of the way that you get there is through these 4 conversations, because they demonstrate your intention as a leader or a manager. And so being intentional about the conversation that you are having is a way to convey, what do you want for your organization? What do you want as a leader for your group? And then lastly, put some structure in place, anything, even just a bit, thinking about the media and the message, thinking about what kinds of interactions I want to have, whether it's team meetings for the work or one-on-one for development. How do I do a performance update for people? Just integrate that into what you are doing every day. And that's the kind of thing that's going to show that you're accountable, which we see as one of those important dimensions for joy at work. So as Roxanne mentioned, our next webinar coming up is going to be Lead a Change You Don't Like. And that seems to come up a lot when we're talking with people. How do I take care of a change that I just don't like, maybe didn't even get to participate in making? And so we'll dive into that into a couple of weeks. So please join us for that.
Yep, every leader encounters that sooner or later.
And then in line with this idea of audio, we have an audio course that is about this, create your personal leadership statement. It is a series of exercises that you can just listen to. You can go to the QR code and find that. And you'll hear Roxanne's lovely voice guide you through what to think about in these 8 lessons to get there. And there's 3 tools that are included as well to help you make all of that happen, and use that leadership statement as a way to convey who you are and want to be as a leader to the people on your team.
Yeah, and I'll just say this was inspired by a leader that I worked for many, many years ago who was kind of scary. And he created a leadership statement to help his team understand who he was and what was important to him. And because of that, it made him so much more approachable. So that's really what inspired this course. So if you find yourself in that situation where people don't really understand, they misunderstand your words or your actions or your requests, having a statement like this that you can share with people, like share with your team that, hey, this is what's important to me and here's why, can be really helpful. At least it certainly was when he did. So anyway, that's the inspiration for this little course.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for taking some time and hanging out with us during lunch here and listening to our thoughts about leader and manager. As always, we are very curious about what others are thinking. So if you have thoughts and want to share those with us, either on LinkedIn or send us an email, happy for any of those. Here's how you can connect to us. Sending an email to joy@thechangedecision.com. And you can see Roxanne and I are relatively prolific writers. And so we've got things on Medium as well as on our own blog, but always glad to be able to hear what people are thinking about it, because that does drive the kinds of things that we try and talk about and write about. This leader versus manager came out of a series of questions that people have asked us. And that's why we got the idea that this would be a useful webinar to do.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you both, Stuart and Robert, for your comments. Really do appreciate your chiming in and sharing your thoughts. It's very helpful to us.
All right, everyone. Well, I think we're going to go and wind up there. Thank you very much for taking the time to hang out with us, and we hope to see you in an upcoming webinar. Take care.